The chandeliers flickered once, as if the entire hotel gasped, right before the crowd erupted in glittering laughter that did not reach their eyes. Beneath those trembling lights, in a ballroom carved from marble and wealth, something was already wrong. It was the kind of wrong no one dared acknowledge because it would mean admitting beauty could rot. The Crystal Harbor Hotel had hosted galas for senators, magnates, and billion-dollar dreamers, yet tonight felt colder, sharper, as if every crystal edge were a blade pointed at anyone who did not belong. Daniel Carter felt those blades each time he stepped across the floor with a silver tray, balanced in one steady hand. The uniform was stiff, the bow tie slightly crooked, but his posture remained disciplined, almost military, though no one knew why. To them, he was invisible, another nameless server drifting through luxury he could never touch. He did not care. He had one purpose here: finish the shift, collect enough tips to keep promises to his daughter, and get home before she fell asleep. Emma would be waiting by the window, tiny hands pressed to the glass, searching the street for his shadow. She always fell asleep clutching the old blue handkerchief he kept in his pocket. Her mother's handkerchief. His anchor. Daniel moved through the crowd with quiet precision, a rhythm refined through years of necessity. But tonight, as he passed the edge of the ballroom, a detail pierced his focus, a young woman sitting alone, back straight, but spirit folded in on itself like fragile paper. Her dress shimmered under the golden lights, elegant and full-skirted, but what drew the eye was the jagged scar running from her temple to her jawline, a lightning bolt carved by fate. Ava Reynolds, the daughter of Jonathan Reynolds, the man everyone whispered about with a mix of awe and fear. He was the kind of CEO who could end or birth empires with a single signature. Yet tonight, he was a father, drowning behind a polite smile. His empire could silence industries, but not the cruelty aimed at his child. Daniel saw Ava tuck a strand of dark hair behind her ear, a futile attempt to hide what she had learned long ago could not be hidden. Her eyes were lowered, lashes fluttering, as if fighting off tears. She looked as though someone had told her she had no right to breathe in that room. He recognized the posture, the hollowing of the chest, the invisible shrinking. He had worn it himself the year his wife died, when the world pressed in too hard and too loudly. He had survived only because Emma pulled him back with tiny hands and fierce belief, whispering that her daddy was a hero. A belief so strong he was afraid to disappoint it. The orchestra shifted into an upbeat tempo. Laughter thickened the air. Couples spun across the floor, their movement bright and careless, a world away from the stillness suffocating the far corner. A group of young men near the bar pointed toward Ava, smirking, their cruelty sharpened by privilege. Daniel paused mid-step. Something tightened in his chest. Across the room, Jonathan Reynolds raised a glass during a conversation he clearly was not hearing. His jaw was locked, hands rigid, knuckles white against the linen-covered table. Every few seconds, his eyes flicked to Ava, then away, as if the sight wounded him. Daniel felt the ripple then, not sound, not motion, but a shift, like the moment before a storm breaks. He turned his head just enough to see a cluster of impeccably dressed women whispering behind their champagne flutes, pity and disdain mingling on their lips. Pity was poison in places like this. Ava shifted slightly in her seat. Not much. Just enough for Daniel to catch the tremor in her fingers. The lights glinted off the scar on her face, and he imagined how many times she wished she could scrub it away. How many mirrors she avoided, how many nights she lay awake, wondering why living had demanded such a price. He inhaled once deeply. His daughter's voice echoed in memory. "You always help people, Daddy? That is what heroes do." The thought struck harder than the ballroom's cold brightness. He should return to the kitchen. Refill glasses, pretend he saw nothing. That was what people expected of him. A server. A shadow. A man meant to stay silent, not interfere. But Daniel Carter did not stay silent. Not when someone was drowning in plain sight. The tray in his hand suddenly felt heavy like a choice leaning toward one edge. He set it down, and the night shifted. The moment Daniel set the tray down, the room seemed to sharpen around him. The music swelled the violins bright and triumphant, a cruel contrast to the bitterness simmering at the edges of the floor. Ava Reynolds kept her gaze fixed on the tablecloth, as if she could disappear into its folds. But cruelty does not let its victims vanish. It hunts them. Near the bar, the young men in tailored suits noticed her stillness again. Their laughter rose, edged with boredom and entitlement. One of them, tall with slicked-back hair and the careless confidence of someone who had never been told no, watched Ava with a smirk forming at the corner of his mouth. "Poor Reynolds," he said loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "All that wealth and his own daughter looks like that." Another clinked his glass against the counter. 50 surgeons could not fix that face. Honestly, why bring her here? The third, emboldened by the others, leaned forward. No one would ever dance with her. She should have stayed home. Their amusement spread like oil, thin, shiny, toxic. A few guests pretended not to hear. Others shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to confront men whose fathers signed their paychecks. Silence became its own form of agreement. Ava heard every word. Her hands clenched the silky fabric of her dress until her knuckles blanched. She forced her breath steady, but her chest trembled. One tear escaped before she could stop it sliding down the scarred side of her face. She wiped it quickly, hoping no one saw. Someone did. Across the ballroom, Daniel watched. His pulse quickened, anger rising with a precision he had not felt in years. He scanned the room, assessing threats patterns, exits, the instincts of a man who had once lived by them. A man no one here suspected existed. But the cruelty had not finished its descent. Near the front tables, a trio of women lifted their glasses and whispered behind jeweled hands. Such a tragedy. Jonathan Reynolds builds an empire and ends up with a daughter like that. Money buys cars, houses, beauty treatments, another murmured. But not real beauty. Not for that girl. The third sighed theatrically. If I looked like her, I would hide forever. Jonathan heard them. Of course he heard them. His expression did not change, but something inside him crumpled. His hand tightened around his wine glass until the stem creaked. He could fire every person in that room, level their futures with a phone call, but it would not erase the words slicing into his daughter, or the fact that he could not shield her from them. Ava swallowed hard. She had survived the crash that carved her face, survived the surgeries, the months of physical agony. But public humiliation, the whispering, the stares, the silent cruelty, that pain was something sharper, more personal, more suffocating. Daniel saw the moment her resolve cracked, the slight hitch in her breath, the way she folded her shoulders inward, a gesture of surrender. Something inside him snapped, not from pity, not from sympathy, from recognition. He knew that posture. He had lived it. In that instant, the ballroom's glittering cruelty became unbearable. Daniel straightened, jaw-firming breath, steadying as if preparing for impact. The lights shimmered across polished marble as he stepped forward, no longer a shadow, no longer invisible. Across the room, Ava lifted her eyes at the exact moment he began to walk toward her. and the cruel choir fell away. Daniel did not plan his next breath. It simply carried him forward, cutting through the glittering ballroom like a quiet, unstoppable tide. Each step echoed against polished marble, steady and deliberate, yet the shift he triggered was immediate. Conversations faltered. A waiter nearly dropped a bottle. Even the orchestra's tempo seemed to waver, as if the music itself sensed something about to break. Ava Reynolds lifted her head slightly, confusion flickering across her features, when she noticed the boy Bon crossing the room with no tray, no purpose except her. Her heart stuttered. People did not walk toward her. They walked around her, past her, away from her, as if her scar were a wall. But this man, this server she had barely noticed before, was moving as if drawn by gravity. Daniel's breath tightened at the sight of her eyes, tired, brave, resigned. Not the eyes of someone fragile, the eyes of someone who had been strong for too long. He reached her table. The room exhaled as one. Ava blinked, startled by his presence. "Is something wrong?" She whispered, her voice soft, careful as though afraid to be overheard. She expected him to say her father needed her, or that she had to move, or that she was blocking someone's view. Instead, Daniel clasped his hands behind his back, straightened his shoulders with a quiet dignity no one expected from a man in a borrowed uniform, and bowed. A respectful, old-fashioned bow that felt like it belonged in a different century, a different world. Gasps rippled through the guests. "Miss," he said gently, "may I have this dance?" The words struck Ava like a blow. For a heartbeat, she did not breathe. She searched his expression for mockery, for pity, for cruelty disguised as charity. But she found none. Only warmth. Only sincerity. "You want to dance with me?" she whispered, stunned. Daniel nodded. "I would be honored." Shock rolled through the ballroom like a wave. People stared openly now, some frowning, some whispering furiously behind raised hands. A few of the crueler voices rose again. He cannot be serious. A waiter with her. What kind of stunt is this? Near the head table, Jonathan Reynolds stood so abruptly his chair scraped against the marble. His breath hitched when he realized what he was witnessing, not humiliation, but possibility. Ava's fingers trembled against the tablecloth. The last time someone had asked her to dance was before the accident, before the surgeries, before the world learned to look at her with something between fear and discomfort. She had told herself she no longer cared. She had lied. I do not know if I can," she whispered. Daniel extended his hand toward her palm, up steady, patient. "You do not have to," he said. "But I want you to know, you deserve to be on that floor as much as anyone here." The words pierced deeper than he could have known. A hand meant to hide her scar lifted slightly. The orchestra shifted into a softer melody, sensing a moment it did not understand. Ava's breath trembled. She stared at his hand, then at the faces watching her, judging, waiting for her to refuse and retreat. But Daniel's eyes held hers with quiet bravery, a bravery she had forgotten she once possessed. Her heartbeat hammered against her ribs. Her throat tightened. Her legs felt heavy, anchored by years of shame. And still, she reached. Slowly, hesitantly, Ava placed her trembling hand into Daniel's. The ballroom fell into stunned silence. No music. No whispers. Just one scarred woman, one unexpected man, and a moment the entire room would remember for as long as they lived. Daniel's fingers closed gently around hers, warm and steady. "Come with me," he said softly. And together, they stepped onto the dance floor. The first step was agony, not because of pain, but because every stair in the ballroom clung to Ava like iron hooks, tugging her backward toward the corner she had tried to disappear into all evening. Her knees weakened. Her breath faltered. Shame, that cruel ghost, rose like a tide inside her chest. Daniel felt the tremor in her hand the moment her heel touched the polished floor. He tightened his gentle grip, not to drag her, but to anchor her the way someone anchors a drowning soul, gasping for air. "It's just us," he murmured, his voice a soft current cutting through the noise swelling around them. "Forget them. Stay with me." Ava forced herself to look at him instead of the sea of glittering eyes and poisoned curiosity. His face held no pity, no discomfort, just a steady calm she could lean into without falling. The orchestra, sensing something unplanned yet cinematic, shifted into a slow, delicate ballad. The melody curled around them like warm light. The crowd instinctively parted, creating a circle of space, as if witnessing a phenomenon none of them had believed possible. Daniel guided Ava into a gentle sway, his hand on her back, warm and respectful, never pushing, only inviting. Their steps aligned slowly, one tentative heartbeat after another. Ava's chest rose with a shaky inhale. Her free hand fluttered instinctively toward her scar, a reflex born from years of hiding. But Daniel caught the motions. "Look at me," he whispered again, firmer this time. She lifted her gaze. His eyes held hers deep and unwavering, and for the first time in years she felt seen, not through the twisted lens of tragedy, but through something clear, human and kind. The ballroom blurred around her. The edges softened. The voices faded. She felt the shift inside her, subtle but powerful, like the first crack of sunlight through storm clouds. Nearby, Jonathan Reynolds gripped the edge of his table with both hands. He was a man who had built companies from dust, who had stared down investors, governments, and rivals with icy precision. Yet now his breath shook. His daughter, his broken, hurting girl, was smiling. Barely there, fragile as a candle flame, but real. A smile he had not seen since before the accident. "My baby girl," he whispered, a crack in his iron composure. "She's smiling." On the dance floor, Ava hardly noticed the tear sliding down her cheek until Daniel brushed his thumb lightly under her eye. Not wiping it away, honoring it. "You're doing beautifully," he said with a quiet certainty that made her throat tighten. Her steps grew steadier. Her shoulders loosened. The music lifted her. Daniel spun her gently, not grandly, not theatrically, but in a way that told her she was safe, that she could trust the moment, even if she could not trust herself. The room watched, spellbound. Some with shame twisting their stomachs. Some with awe they did not know how to express. Others simply silent, confronted by their own cruelty. Ava felt their eyes, but they no longer pierced her. They passed through her like wind through open doors. Daniel's presence pulled her into a space where pain lost its grip, where memory and fear stepped back, even if only for the length of a song. And then it happened. Unexpected, gentle, impossible. A laugh slipped from her lips, soft and pure, blooming like a fragile flower in winter. Daniel's face lit up as if he'd been waiting to see that one moment all night. She realized then that she was not dancing with a stranger. She was dancing with someone who had recognized her pain the moment he saw it, someone who had stepped through a wall no one else dared approach, someone who with a single outstretched hand had returned a piece of her she thought the world had destroyed. The ballad softened into its final notes. Daniel slowed their movement to a gentle stop, his hand still holding hers, as if afraid to break the fragile miracle they had created together. Ava breathed out long and trembling, her heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time since the accident, she felt alive. The final note of the ballad faded into the rafters like a sigh the ballroom had been holding for far too long. And for a heartbeat, everything stood still. Ava remained in Daniel's arms. Her breath measured her pulse, fluttering like the wings of something newly reborn. Around them, silence pooled thick and heavy, not out of reverence, but out of disbelief. No one had expected the scarred daughter of a titan and a nameless waiter to create a moment capable of softening the entire room. Yet the stillness did not feel triumphant. It felt fragile, as if one careless breath could shatter the thin shell of courage Ava had built in the last few minutes. Then the spell broke in the most unexpected way. Across the ballroom, a small voice burst through the quiet, so bright and earnest, it sliced clean through the tension. Daddy, the cry echoed with such unfiltered joy that every head turned instinctively. A small girl in a pink dress sprinted across the floor, her pigtails bouncing a sheet of crayon-scribbled paper clutched in her hand. Emma Carter had been waiting backstage where staff children were often kept during long shifts, but curiosity had tugged her forward. And when she saw her father dancing with the sad-looking woman in the corner, someone the child judged not by scars, but by spirit, she did what only a child could do. She ran toward truth, not decorum. Her small shoes tapped sharply against the marble as she reached the couple. She lifted the drawing triumphantly for the entire ballroom to witness. Two stick figures holding hands beneath a chandelier, one tall in a bow tie and the other in a swirling blue gown. Above the figures in large, uneven letters, she had written, "Daddy dancing with a princess." For a moment, the crowd was unreadable. Neither scorn nor admiration, simply stunned. Then something warm rippled across the faces of the guests. A few laughed not with mockery, but with tenderness. Others exhaled as though the innocence had peeled layers of pretension from them. The tension cracked open like an egg spilling light where darkness had been festering only minutes earlier. Ava stared at the drawing, her eyes widening, her hand lifting slowly to her mouth. Something inside her chest tightened so fiercely she had to steady herself. The child beamed up at her, unafraid of the scar, unafraid of the past, unafraid of strangers. Children know truths adults work hard to ignore. They recognize beauty where adults have been taught to overlook it. Emma reached out, touched the hem of Ava's gown, and whispered with delighted sincerity, "You really look like a princess." The words struck with the force of a revelation. Ava's throat constricted, and tears surged not from hurt, but from something startlingly unfamiliar joy. She knelt down, heart trembling, and folded the small girl into her arms. The audience witnessed not a pity embrace, but a connection so pure it was almost sacred. Emma hugged her tightly, giggling as she whispered, "Don't let anyone tell you you're not pretty. Daddy says pretty is what's inside." Daniel's breath caught when he heard his daughter echo words he had once told her on nights she cried, missing her mother, and in that instant the room changed. The coldness thawed. The hidden cruelties seemed petty, foolish, embarrassing. A soft wave of applause began tentative, at first rising slowly, then building into a full resonant cheer that filled the ballroom with warmth the chandeliers had failed to provide. Jonathan Reynolds approached, his gaze fixed not on his daughter's scar, but on the light returning to her eyes. Each step he took seemed heavier than the last. His chest heaved with emotions he had caged for too long. When he finally reached them, Ava, Daniel, and Emma frozen in a tableau of improbable grace, his voice faltered. "Thank you," he said to Daniel, but his words were meant for more than the dance. "You gave her something I have not seen in years. You gave her back. Herself." Daniel shook his head slowly. "She never lost it. She only needed someone to remind her." Jonathan swallowed hard, struggling to maintain his composure. But when he opened his mouth to speak again, something unexpected happened. A small square of faded blue fabric slipped from Daniel's jacket pocket and drifted to the floor. Jonathan's eyes locked onto it instantly. He stooped to pick it up, fingers trembling, breath abandoning him when he felt the delicate embroidery along the edge initials stitched in gold thread. A shock rippled across his face, so sharp and raw, the room seemed to tilt around him. In that second, the night was about to unravel into a revelation no one could have foreseen. Jonathan Reynolds stood frozen, the murmur of the ballroom dissolving into a distant echo as he stared at the faded handkerchief resting in his palm. The fabric was soft from years of use, edges worn thin, but the gold-stitched initials along the corner gleamed unmistakably beneath the chandelier light. M.R. Those two letters belonged to one person only, his brother, Captain Michael Reynolds, the man whose death carved a wound Jonathan had never allowed the world to witness. Daniel saw the moment recognition struck the way Jonathan's jaw tightened, and his breath disappeared, and a weight settled in Daniel's chest. He had carried this truth for so many years that it felt fused to him, like an invisible scar. Still, he stepped forward with the same steady composure he once used to approach wounded soldiers. "It belonged to my commanding officer," he said quietly. "Captain Michael Reynolds saved my life." The words rippled through the guests closest to them, bending the air with sudden tension. Jonathan's fingers sank into the cloth as if he feared it might vanish his gaze, lifting slowly to Daniel's face with raw disbelief. Memories surged: Michael's laugh, his impossible courage, his promise to come home. The military report had never given details. Only the date, the location, and the devastating finality. He was with someone, Jonathan whispered, the question trembling out of him like something fragile. Daniel nodded, the memory rising vivid and sharp. "The convoy was hit. Our vehicle went up first. He dragged me through the flames even though he was wounded." He swallowed, steadying his voice. I held his hand at the end. He asked me to tell his family he loved them, and that he was proud of his little brother. Jonathan inhaled sharply, the sound breaking from him like a painful release, and several guests turned away, unable to watch a titan crumble. For years, Jonathan had carried anger like armor, anger at the war, at the unanswered questions, at the silence that followed his brother's death. Hearing this truth now unraveled something deep within him. His shoulders sagged, as though the weight of 2 decades had landed all at once. He pressed the handkerchief to his chest, closing his eyes as grief poured through him, not with violence, but with long-denied tenderness. When he opened them again, they were wet, unguarded, human. Around them, the ballroom shifted into reverent stillness. The wealthy, the polished, the arrogant, and all those who had dismissed Daniel as nothing more than a waiter, now stared at him with dawning understanding. A man they had overlooked carried a story etched in courage and sacrifice. Ava watched him too. Her breath caught her assumptions dissolving as she realized the quiet strength beneath Daniel's gentle exterior. Jonathan stepped forward and placed a trembling hand on Daniel's shoulder, a gesture that bridged 20 years of unanswered longing. "You brought my brother home tonight," he said, voice breaking, yet certain. Not his body, his truth, his memory. And in that moment, the room understood. The true power did not come from rank or wealth, but from the man who had carried honor in his pocket, waiting for the right night to return it. The ballroom had barely absorbed the shock of Jonathan's revelation, when the atmosphere shifted again, sharp as a blade drawn across silk. The same wealthy young men who had mocked Ava earlier stood rigid near the bar, their arrogance leaking away as realization settled over the room. Their laughter, their cruelty, their careless words suddenly felt louder in hindsight, echoing against the truth that the man they had ridiculed was a soldier, a survivor, and now a bridge to a fallen hero. Jonathan turned toward them slowly, the handkerchief still clutched in his fist, his expression no longer broken, but forged in a fire no one in that room could match. He walked across the marble floor with the authority of a man who had reclaimed something sacred. And as he stopped before the young men, silence wrapped around them like a noose. "You spoke about my daughter," he said, voice low but heavy enough to still the air. "You laughed at her pain. You reduced her to a scar." One of the young men opened his mouth to speak, but Jonathan's raised hand stopped him immediately. The gesture carried a power that silenced even arrogance. "You will leave this event," he continued, "and you will not come near my company or my family again." A security team moved with swift obedience, guiding the boys out as their faces burned with humiliation. Jonathan did not stop there. He turned toward the cluster of women who had whispered behind their jeweled glasses, their expressions collapsing under the weight of their own shame. "You spoke of her as if she were damaged," he said, the words cutting cleanly, "as if value could be measured by perfection. But the only thing broken tonight was your character." The women lowered their eyes, the judgment settling on them with deserved heaviness. The rest of the guests backed away from them instinctively, their silence forming an unspoken verdict. Then Jonathan stepped onto the small stage, motioning for the orchestra to pause. The musicians fell silent, leaving only the faint hum of the chandeliers overhead. His voice carried through the room with unexpected clarity. "Tonight has revealed something I never wanted to see," he said. "Not just the cruelty you have shown my daughter, but the blindness you carry toward true worth. A man you dismissed as nothing has shown more courage, honor, and humanity than many of you have displayed in a lifetime." He gestured toward Daniel, who stood beside Ava, uncertain, modest, unwilling to occupy the spotlight that had been forced upon him. "This man stepped forward when all of you stepped back. He saw my daughter when you refused to look. He brought me a truth I have needed for 20 years, and he asked for nothing in return." A murmur of agreement swept through the room, admiration blooming where mockery had once lived. Ava felt emotion swell in her chest, not from the attention on Daniel, but from the realization that her father was fighting for her. Not as a CEO, but as a father reclaiming everything she had lost. Daniel shifted, embarrassed by the praise, but meeting Ava's gaze with a quiet steadiness that told her he had no regrets. Jonathan's final words fell over the room, like a verdict wrapped in hope. "Tonight, remember, this dignity comes from courage, not wealth. And kindness is worth more than every dollar in this room." The applause that followed was not polite, but thunderous, rising like absolution through the golden lit hall. The ballroom had barely absorbed the shock of Jonathan's revelation when the atmosphere shifted again, sharp as a blade drawn across silk. The same wealthy young men who had mocked Ava earlier stood rigid near the bar, their arrogance leaking away as realization settled over the room. Their laughter, their cruelty, their careless words suddenly felt louder in hindsight, echoing against the truth that the man they had ridiculed was a soldier, a survivor, and now a bridge to a fallen hero. Jonathan turned toward them slowly, the handkerchief still clutched in his fist, his expression no longer broken, but forged in a fire no one in that room could match. He walked across the marble floor with the authority of a man who had reclaimed something sacred, and as he stopped before the young men, silence wrapped around them like a noose. "You spoke about my daughter," he said, voice low, but heavy enough to still the air. "You laughed at her pain. You reduced her to a scar." One of the young men opened his mouth to speak, but Jonathan's raised hand stopped him immediately. The gesture carried a power that silenced even arrogance. "You will leave this event," he continued, "and you will not come near my company or my family again." A security team moved with swift obedience, guiding the boys out as their faces burned with humiliation. Jonathan did not stop there. He turned toward the cluster of women who had whispered behind their jeweled glasses, their expressions collapsing under the weight of their own shame. You spoke of her as if she were damaged, he said, the words cutting cleanly, as if value could be measured by perfection. But the only thing broken tonight was your character. The women lowered their eyes at the judgment settling on them with deserved heaviness. The rest of the guests backed away from them instinctively, their silence forming an unspoken verdict. Then Jonathan stepped onto the small stage, motioning for the orchestra to pause. The musicians fell silent, leaving only the faint hum of the chandeliers overhead. His voice carried through the room with unexpected clarity. "Tonight has revealed something I never wanted to see," he said. "Not just the cruelty you have shown my daughter, but the blindness you carry toward true worth. A man you dismissed as nothing has shown more courage, honor, and humanity than many of you have displayed in a lifetime." He gestured toward Daniel, who stood beside Ava, uncertain, modest, unwilling to occupy the spotlight that had been forced upon him. "This man stepped forward when all of you stepped back. He saw my daughter when you refused to look. He brought me a truth I have needed for 20 years. And he asked for nothing in return." A murmur of agreement swept through the room, admiration blooming where mockery had once lived. Ava felt emotion swell in her chest, not from the attention on Daniel, but from the realization that her father was fighting for her. Not as a CEO, but as a father reclaiming everything she had lost. Daniel shifted, embarrassed by the praise, but meeting Ava's gaze with a quiet steadiness that told her he had no regrets. Jonathan's final words fell over the room like a verdict wrapped in hope. "Tonight, remember, this dignity comes from courage, not wealth. And kindness is worth more than every dollar in this room." The applause that followed was not polite, but thunderous, rising like absolution through the golden-lit hall. In the end, this story reminds us of a truth: experts in human behavior repeat often, dignity is not granted by status, beauty, or wealth, but by the courage to see and be seen with honesty. Moments like these show how a single act of compassion can interrupt years of pain, shift power, and restore a person's sense of self more profoundly than any grand gesture. Daniel's choice to step forward is the kind psychologists call a pivot moment, a decision that alters not just one life, but many. If stories that reveal the strength inside ordinary people resonate with you, consider liking this video and subscribing for more narratives that uncover humanity's quiet heroism. And before you go, share your voice with the community by commenting just 3 words that capture what this story means to you. Try writing "Still Worthy Always."